I had dreamed about visiting Italy for years before it finally happened. Ever since I was a teenager, I had been fascinated by the language, the food, the architecture, and the slow, romantic lifestyle that people always talked about when they described Italian cities. I used to watch travel videos late at night while imagining myself walking through narrow streets with old buildings on both sides, hearing people speak Italian around me, and sitting in small cafes drinking coffee while writing in a notebook. When I started studying Italian, my dream became even stronger. At first, learning the language felt difficult. The pronunciation was beautiful but challenging. Some expressions sounded musical to me, while others twisted my tongue in impossible ways. Still, I continued studying every day. I listened to podcasts while cooking dinner, repeated vocabulary words before going to sleep, and watched Italian movies with subtitles during weekends. Slowly, the language started making sense. After almost 2 years of studying, I finally decided to book my trip to Italy. I remember the excitement I felt the moment I bought the plane ticket. I stared at the confirmation email for almost 10 minutes because I could not believe it was real. I was actually going. I was finally going to hear the language in real life instead of through headphones. The weeks before the trip were filled with preparation. I made lists of places I wanted to visit, phrases I wanted to practice, and foods I absolutely needed to try. I packed more carefully than I ever had before. I brought comfortable shoes for walking, a small camera, a journal, and 3 different Italian grammar books that I honestly did not need, but packed anyway. The flight felt endless. I barely slept because my mind was racing with excitement. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined arriving in Italy and speaking confidently with local people. In my imagination, every conversation went perfectly. I understood everything people said. I responded naturally. Everyone smiled and complimented my Italian. Reality, however, turned out to be slightly different. When the plane finally landed in Rome, my heart started beating faster. I looked through the airplane window and saw the airport buildings under the bright morning sunlight. I suddenly felt nervous. For the first time, I realized that I would actually need to use the language outside my bedroom. Inside the airport, I heard Italian everywhere. People were speaking quickly at the coffee shops. Airport workers were making announcements. Families were talking loudly while collecting their luggage. For a moment, I froze. I recognized many words, but everything sounded faster than the recordings I had practiced with. I had spent months listening to slow educational audio, but real conversations moved at full speed. Still, I reminded myself why I had come. I was not there to be perfect. I was there to learn. At passport control, the officer greeted me in Italian. My brain panicked for half a second, but I managed to answer. Buongiorno. The officer asked me a question that I only partially understood. I smiled nervously and asked him to repeat it. This time, I understood. He wanted to know how long I would stay in Italy. 10 giorni, I answered proudly. 10 days. The officer stamped my passport and smiled politely. That small interaction lasted less than 30 seconds, but to me it felt like a major victory. Outside the airport, the air smelled different from home. The streets were busy, the sunlight felt warmer, and the buildings looked exactly like the photographs I had admired online for years. I took a train into the city center while staring out the window the entire time. Graffiti-covered walls passed by quickly. Old apartment buildings stood beside modern shops. People sat outside cafes drinking espresso even though it was still early. Everything felt alive. I checked into my small hotel near the historic center of Rome. The receptionist spoke English fluently, but I tried using Italian as much as possible. Sto imparando l'italiano, I explained. I am learning Italian. She smiled kindly and spoke a little slower for me. That immediately made me feel more confident. After leaving my suitcase in the room, I decided to walk around the city. I wandered through crowded streets without paying attention to time. Every corner seemed beautiful. I saw tiny bakeries with fresh bread in the windows, fountains surrounded by tourists, and small fruit markets filled with colorful produce. I stopped constantly just to listen. Sometimes I understood entire conversations. Other times, I only recognized a few scattered words. But even when I did not understand everything, I loved hearing the rhythm of the language. Hours passed quickly. By early afternoon, I realized something important. I was starving. I had eaten almost nothing during the flight, and all the walking had made me even hungrier. At first, I thought about finding a tourist restaurant where people probably spoke English, but then I remembered one of the main reasons for my trip. I wanted to practice. I wanted real experiences. So I decided to find a local restaurant and order entirely in Italian. At that moment, it sounded like a fantastic idea. A few minutes later, I found a small restaurant on a quiet street. It did not look fancy. There were only a few outdoor tables covered with red tablecloths and handwritten menus hung beside the entrance. The place seemed calm compared to the crowded tourist areas nearby. An older man stood outside arranging chairs. When he noticed me looking at the menu, he smiled. "Prego," he said warmly. I took a deep breath and walked inside. Immediately, I noticed the smell of garlic, tomatoes, olive oil, and freshly baked bread. The restaurant was cozy and dimly lit. Soft music played in the background while people talked quietly over plates of pasta. A waitress approached me with a menu. "Solo?" she asked. I knew that one. "See," I answered. "Just one person." She led me to a small table near the window. The moment I sat down, my confidence disappeared. The menu was entirely in Italian. Not tourist Italian. Real Italian. Suddenly, all the vocabulary I had studied seemed to vanish from my brain. I stared at the menu while trying not to panic. Some words looked familiar. Others looked completely new. I recognized pasta, pollo, and formaggio. But many dishes contained ingredients I had never learned. The waitress returned with water. "Avete deciso?" she asked. "Have you decided?" My brain froze. I understood the question, but I was not ready. "Un momento, per favor," I replied carefully. "One moment, please." She nodded and walked away. I immediately grabbed my phone under the table. I had promised myself I would not rely too heavily on translation apps, but at that moment I desperately needed help. Still, I tried to resist. Instead of translating everything immediately, I forced myself to study the menu. I started breaking words apart. I guessed meanings based on context. I searched my memory for vocabulary from my lessons. Slowly, the menu became less intimidating. I realized one dish contained mushrooms. Another had seafood. One included eggplant. I felt proud every time I recognized an ingredient. Then the waitress returned again. This time, I was determined to order in Italian. I smiled nervously. "Vorrei," I began. "I would like." Then I completely mispronounced the name of the pasta dish. The waitress blinked. I repeated it. Still wrong. Now I was embarrassed. I pointed awkwardly at the menu. The waitress looked down and immediately understood. "Ah, la carbonara," she said gently. "Yes," I answered too enthusiastically. She smiled politely. Then she asked another question. I understood absolutely nothing. Not one word. I stared at her with wide eyes. My brain searched desperately for clues. Was she asking about drinks? Side dishes? Portion size? I had no idea. "Mi dispiace," I said quietly. "Sto imparando l'italiano." I am sorry. I am learning Italian. Her expression softened immediately. Then she repeated the question more slowly. This time, I caught a few words. Sparkling water or still water. Finally, I understood. "Acqua natural," I answered. "Still water." "Perfetto," she replied. The interaction had probably seemed normal to everyone else in the restaurant, but to me it felt emotionally exhausting. Using a foreign language in real life was completely different from practicing alone at home. At home, nobody was waiting for my answer. Nobody was watching me struggle. Nobody cared if I took 30 seconds to remember a word. But in the restaurant, every second felt important. Even so, I also felt strangely happy. I was finally using the language for something real. Not an exercise. Not a quiz. Not an app. A real conversation. While waiting for my food, I listened carefully to nearby conversations. The couple at the next table spoke rapidly with animated gestures. A family near the back laughed loudly every few minutes. The waiters moved quickly between tables while shouting short phrases to each other. At first, the language sounded chaotic. But after sitting there for a while, my ears slowly adjusted. I started recognizing sentence patterns. I noticed common expressions. I even understood pieces of random conversations. That gave me confidence again. A basket of bread arrived first. The smell was incredible. I had not realized how hungry I truly was until that moment. When the carbonara finally arrived, it looked even better than I imagined. The pasta was covered in creamy sauce with black pepper and pieces of crispy guanciale. I took one bite and nearly closed my eyes from happiness. It was one of the best things I had ever eaten. For several minutes, I forgot completely about language anxiety. I simply enjoyed the moment. Then the waitress returned once more. "How is everything?" she asked in Italian. This time, I understood immediately. "Molto buono," I answered. "Very good." She smiled. That tiny moment felt easier than the earlier conversation. Maybe my brain was finally relaxing. Or maybe I was beginning to adapt. As I continued eating, I started reflecting on why learning languages mattered so much to me. Before studying Italian, Italy had always seemed distant and romanticized, almost like a movie. But understanding even small pieces of the language changed everything. The country no longer felt like a postcard. It felt real. The language allowed me to connect with people instead of simply observing them from a distance. Even when I made mistakes, those mistakes created interactions. People smiled. They corrected me kindly. They encouraged me. That human connection mattered more than perfect grammar. After finishing most of the pasta, I decided to be brave again. I wanted dessert. Unfortunately, this required another conversation. The waitress approached with the dessert menu. I studied it carefully. This time, I recognized more words. Tiramisu. That one was easy. When she returned, I ordered more confidently. Vorrei il tiramisu, per favor. Perfect pronunciation? Probably not. But understandable. That was enough. The waitress nodded without confusion. I silently celebrated. The tiramisu arrived a few minutes later. It was soft, creamy, and lightly dusted with cocoa powder. I ate slowly while watching people pass outside the restaurant window. The sunlight had shifted by then, giving the street a warm golden color. People walked casually without seeming rushed. A man rode past on a bicycle. Two elderly women talked near a corner while carrying shopping bags. Somewhere nearby, church bells rang softly. Everything felt cinematic. When I finally finished eating, I faced one last challenge: paying the bill. I knew this part should have been simple, but my nervousness returned anyway. The waitress approached again. "Posso avere il conto?" I asked carefully. "Could I have the bill?" Success. No confusion. No awkward pause. She brought the bill a moment later. As I prepared to pay, she looked at me and asked where I was from. This conversation lasted longer than the earlier ones. I explained, slowly and imperfectly, that I had been studying Italian for 2 years. She listened patiently. Then she told me something that I will never forget. "Il tuo italiano è molto buono. Non aver paura di parlar." Your Italian is very good. Do not be afraid to speak. I knew my Italian was far from very good. I had made pronunciation mistakes. I had needed repetition. I had looked confused multiple times. But her encouragement meant a lot to me. Language learners often focus too much on mistakes. We forget that communication itself is already an achievement. When I left the restaurant, I felt lighter. Not because I had spoken perfectly, but because I had survived the experience. Actually, more than survived. I had enjoyed it. I walked through Rome that afternoon with much more confidence than before. The city no longer felt intimidating. I started entering small shops just to practice simple conversations. I bought postcards in Italian. I asked for directions in Italian. I ordered coffee in Italian. Sometimes people answered me in English anyway. Sometimes they corrected my pronunciation. Sometimes I misunderstood completely. But every interaction taught me something. That evening, I sat near a fountain writing in my journal. I described the restaurant experience in detail because I did not want to forget it. Looking back now, I realize that lunch became one of the most important moments of my trip. Not because of the pasta, although the pasta was unforgettable, and not because of the tiramisu, although that was incredible too. It mattered because it forced me to stop hiding behind preparation. Before traveling, I had spent years studying Italian safely from a distance. I memorized vocabulary. I completed exercises. I listened to recordings. But real language learning begins when you risk embarrassment. When you speak despite uncertainty. When you continue talking even after making mistakes. That lunch taught me something valuable. People usually care less about your mistakes than you think. Most people appreciate effort, especially when someone is trying to learn their language. During the following days in Italy, I became much more adventurous. I visited Florence and Venice after Rome. In Florence, I accidentally asked for 2 sandwiches instead of 1 because I confused singular and plural words. The cashier laughed kindly, and I laughed too. In Venice, I got lost while trying to ask for directions and ended up walking in circles for nearly an hour. Still, every mistake became part of the adventure. One afternoon in Florence, I entered a bookstore and attempted to ask an employee for recommendations. The conversation was difficult. I spoke slowly. He spoke quickly. But somehow we understood each other. He eventually recommended a simple Italian novel for language learners. I bought it immediately. At night, I read a few pages before sleeping. Sometimes I understood only half the text. But even half felt exciting. Another memorable moment happened in Venice. I stopped at a small cafe to order coffee. This time, the interaction felt surprisingly natural. I ordered confidently. I understood the waiter immediately. I even made a small joke in Italian. It was not a particularly funny joke. But the waiter laughed. That tiny moment made me realize how much progress I had already made during the trip. Not because my grammar had suddenly improved, but because my fear had decreased. Confidence changes everything. By the final days of the trip, I noticed something interesting. Italian no longer sounded like random noise around me. My brain had started separating words automatically. I could follow simple conversations more easily. I could predict common phrases. Menus no longer terrified me. Of course, I still had a long way to go. There were many conversations I could not fully understand. Native speakers still talked too quickly for me sometimes. And I still made grammar mistakes constantly. But I no longer felt ashamed of learning. That changed the entire experience. On my last night in Italy, I returned to the same restaurant in Rome where I had eaten lunch on my first day. I almost could not believe I had found it again. The same older man stood outside arranging chairs. This time, I greeted him confidently. Buonasera. Good evening. Inside, the restaurant looked exactly the same. The warm lighting, the soft music, the smell of garlic and bread. Even the waitress recognized me. You came back, she said in Italian. I smiled proudly. Yes, because the food was amazing. This conversation flowed more naturally than our first one. I still made mistakes, but I no longer panicked when I forgot words. Instead, I described things differently. I improvised. I communicated. That night, ordering dinner felt much easier. Not easy, but easier. And that difference meant everything. The waitress eventually asked me how long I had been studying Italian. When I told her 2 years, she looked surprised. Then she said something encouraging again. Parli con il cuore. You speak with your heart. I loved that expression. Maybe my grammar was imperfect. Maybe my pronunciation still sounded foreign. But I was genuinely trying. And people could feel that. After dinner, I walked slowly through the streets of Rome one last time. The city glowed under the evening lights. Tourists filled the plazas. Street musicians performed near fountains. Restaurants buzzed with conversation. I realized that the trip had changed me. Not dramatically. Not magically. But quietly. Before traveling, I believed language learning was mainly about accuracy. Now I understood it was also about courage. Courage to sound imperfect. Courage to misunderstand. Courage to continue anyway. Back home, many people later asked me about Italy. They expected stories about famous landmarks. The Colosseum. The canals of Venice. the museums of Florence. And yes, those places were beautiful. But strangely, one of my favorite memories remained that first lunch in Rome. A simple meal, a nervous language learner, a patient waitress, and a conversation full of mistakes. Because that moment represented something bigger. It represented growth. Every language learner eventually reaches a point where studying alone is no longer enough. At some point, you must speak. Even if your voice shakes. Even if your grammar fails. Even if you feel embarrassed. That is where real learning begins. Sometimes people avoid speaking because they want to sound perfect first. I used to think that way too. But perfection is impossible. Even advanced learners make mistakes. Even fluent speakers misunderstand things. Communication is not about perfection. It is about connection. And, honestly, some of my mistakes in Italy became my favorite memories. Like the time I accidentally used the wrong verb and told a waiter that I was cold food instead of saying the food was cold. Or the moment I confused fish with peach at a market. The vendor looked extremely confused. Then we both started laughing. Those embarrassing moments taught me more than any textbook exercise ever could. When I think back to that first restaurant experience now, I remember how nervous I felt before entering. I remember staring at the menu in panic. I remember forgetting words I definitely knew. But I also remember the excitement. The thrill of understanding real conversations. The satisfaction of successfully ordering food. The kindness of people who encouraged me. Traveling alone in another country can feel intimidating. Learning another language can feel intimidating too. Combining both experiences at the same time sometimes felt overwhelming. But it also made me stronger. After returning home, I continued studying Italian with even more motivation. Now, when I listened to podcasts or practiced vocabulary, the language no longer felt abstract. Every word connected to memories. Restaurants. Train stations, coffee shops, busy streets, sunlight on old buildings, church bells in the distance, laughter around dinner tables. The language had become alive. That changed everything. Months later, I watched videos from my trip again. In one video, you can hear people talking in the background at the restaurant. At the time, I barely understood them. But later, I realized I could suddenly recognize entire phrases. That moment made me incredibly happy. Progress often happens slowly. So slowly that you do not notice it day by day. But eventually, one day, you realize something that once felt impossible has become natural. That is one of the most rewarding parts of language learning. You slowly build a new way to experience the world. Italy taught me many things. It taught me to slow down. It taught me to enjoy long meals. It taught me to appreciate small conversations. But most importantly, it taught me not to fear mistakes. Now, whenever someone tells me they're afraid to speak a language they are learning, I always think about that restaurant in Rome. I think about how terrified I felt before ordering. And I think about how proud I felt afterward. If I had chosen the easy option and spoken only English, the experience would have been simpler. But it also would have been less meaningful. Struggling through conversations gave me memories that I still treasure today. Sometimes growth begins with something very small. A sentence. A question. A nervous attempt to communicate. For me, it began with a menu in a small Italian restaurant at lunchtime. And honestly, I would relive that moment 1,000 times. Even the awkward parts. Especially the awkward parts. Because those moments proved that I was trying. And trying is always better than staying silent. So if you are learning a language right now, maybe this story can encourage you. Do not wait until you feel perfect. Do not wait until every grammar rule feels easy. Speak. Order food. Ask questions. Make mistakes. Get confused. Laugh at yourself. Then continue. Because every awkward conversation brings you closer to confidence. And one day, you may find yourself sitting in a restaurant somewhere far from home, realizing that the language you once struggled to understand has slowly become part of your life. That feeling is unforgettable. And for me, it all started with lunch in Italy.